December 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. The Germans' last major offensive in the Ardennes had completely cut off the city, surrounding thousands of American soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division with no supplies or reinforcements. For 7 crucial days, while Panzer tanks tried to break through the defensive lines, a silent battle for life unfolded inside the city's makeshift medical posts. The scalpel trembled in the gloved hand as German artillery made the cellar shudder. Dr. Robert Hastings could not stop now. The soldier before him had only minutes before internal bleeding claimed his life. It was Christmas Eve 1944, and in Bastogne there were no gifts, only the chance to keep a heart beating for one more day. American combat medics defied Crossfire and saved hundreds in the Battle of Bastogne was more than a war story. It was the account of how improvised military medicine became the last barrier between hope and total despair. Outside, German tanks advanced through the snow. Inside, scalpels fought death with the same intensity as rifles. The yellow glow of a kerosene lamp danced across the damp cellar walls as Dr. Robert Hastings examined the soldier's abdominal wound. The smell of ether mixed with burnt gunpowder hung in the heavy air, creating a surreal atmosphere in that frozen December of 1944. His hands, though steady, carried the exhaustion of 3 days without proper sleep. The distant sound of German mortars echoed like a dark drum, a constant reminder that Bastogne was completely surrounded. Each explosion made the surgical instruments clink against the improvised trays, creating a macabre symphony of war and medicine. The young soldier on the improvised operating table murmured his mother's name between muffled groans. The war had turned that ruined house's basement into the only functioning medical post in the city's eastern sector. Hastings knew he had no choice. Either he saved that life right there with limited resources, or he would lose another man to the bloody statistics of the Battle of the Bulge. Nurse Sarah Mitchell organized the few remaining medical supplies in a wooden crate that served as a makeshift pharmacy cabinet. Her agile hands sorted bandages, sulfa powder, and the last vials of morphine with the precision of someone who had learned to improvise under Crossfire. Her once white uniform had turned gray from smoke and dust, but her eyes kept the determination that had earned her the soldiers' respect. She had arrived in Bastogne just a week before the German siege, coming straight from the Normandy field hospitals. The D-Day experience had taught her that wartime medicine was not about hospital protocols, but about courage and creativity. When Hastings asked for more sterile gauze, she knew there was none left. Only clean strips torn from the shirts of dead soldiers. Improvisation had become the norm, and every supply saved meant one more life they could try to preserve. The war had shown that combat medics did not follow manuals, only their own conscience in the face of each urgent wound. Sergeant James Porter lay in a corner of the cellar, recovering from shrapnel that had pierced his right shoulder 3 days earlier. His heavy artillery unit had been destroyed in a German bombing, making him a permanent patient in that underground hospital. Porter watched every move of the medical team with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. Guilt for taking up space while other soldiers arrived in far worse condition. The metal fragments were still lodged near the bone, but Hastings had decided to wait for a more elaborate surgery when, if, reinforcements arrived. The metallic sound of the surgical tools against the improvised trays created a steady rhythm that blended with Porter's heavy breathing. He had become something of a mascot for the medical team, helping to organize bandages and comforting the younger soldiers who arrived in panic. His combat experience gave him a unique perspective in that medical setting. He understood war from both sides, as a fighter and as a patient. His presence in the cellar represented something deeper than the doctors had yet realized, living proof that it was possible to survive the hell of Bastogne. The explosions outside grew louder as night fell over the besieged city, and Hastings realized more wounded would soon arrive. The system for transporting casualties had been reduced to soldiers carrying their comrades on their backs through streets littered with rubble and blood-stained snow. Each new patient meant impossible decisions about medical priorities. Who should be treated first when everyone seemed to be dying at once? The doctor had studied medicine at Harvard University, once dreaming of a private clinic in Boston, but the war had turned him into a specialist in emergency surgery under extreme conditions. His hands, which once trembled during the first field surgeries in France, now moved with the precision of a veteran who had learned to operate while bombs exploded around him. The rough texture of the frozen bandages between his fingers had become familiar, as had the weight of deciding who would live and who would die. The bitter December cold made every procedure harder, as liquids froze and instruments grew painfully cold to the touch. Sarah Mitchell lit another lamp when she noticed the light was no longer enough for surgical procedures. The black kerosene smoke, mixed with the vapor of human breath, forming a dense haze that made it difficult to see. She had learned to work almost in total darkness during night bombardments, when any light could draw the attention of German gunners. Her hands knew the exact location of every instrument, every vial of medicine, every piece of clean gauze. Wartime nursing had given her an almost supernatural intuition about her patient's conditions. She could sense changes in breathing, signs of infection or internal bleeding, just by noticing details others would miss. Traditional medical training had not prepared her for medicine practiced in bombed-out basements, but necessity had made her an expert in medical improvisation. When soldiers arrived in shock, she knew exactly what words to use to keep them conscious and cooperative during treatment. War had turned nurses into psychologists, surgical assistants, and sometimes the only source of hope wounded soldiers could find. The sound of boots clattering down the makeshift stairs broke the tense silence of the cellar as two soldiers carried another wounded man. The young soldier had a gunshot wound to the chest, and his labored breathing suggested a possible punctured lung. Hastings looked at Sarah and saw on her face the same expression he felt. Another life depending on resources that no longer existed, and on medical knowledge that had to be reinvented with every emergency. Porter rose from his resting place and moved closer to help, ignoring the pain in his own injured shoulder. The solidarity between the wounded and the medical team had created an unlikely family in that underground hospital. The new patient muttered something about German tanks just 2 blocks away, reminding everyone that the siege was tightening even more. The Battle of Bastogne was not only being fought in the streets with rifles and grenades, but also in that damp basement where each life saved represented a small victory against total despair. Hastings gripped the scalpel and took a deep breath, preparing for yet another surgery that would determine whether that soldier would see Christmas 1944. "Doctor, we need to decide now. We have enough morphine for only 2 more critical cases, or we try to save this one without anesthesia." The decision about the morphine could not be postponed as the soldier with the chest wound struggled to breathe on the improvised operating table. Dr. Hastings held the last 2 vials of the painkiller, knowing that this choice would determine not only who would feel pain, but possibly who would survive until dawn. The metallic smell of blood mixed with the acrid scent of gunpowder smoke seeping through the cracks in the cellar windows. Sarah Mitchell prepared the surgical instruments with mechanical movements, but her eyes revealed the tension of someone who had faced impossible decisions for the 10th time that week. The distant sound of approaching German tanks created an added urgency. They had to operate quickly, because there might not be time for lengthy procedures. Porter watched from his spot, remembering when he himself had been on the operating table 3 days earlier, grateful he had received anesthesia while supplies were still sufficient. The cold metal of the scalpel in Hastings's palm contrasted with the feverish heat of the wounded soldier. War had turned medical decisions into moral dilemmas no medical school could ever teach how to resolve. The kerosene lamp flickered with the vibrations of the outside explosions, casting dancing shadows that made the surgery even more challenging. The soldier with the chest wound could not have been more than 19, his uniform bearing the patch of the 327th Glider Infantry, one of the units defending Bastogne's northern perimeter. His identification tags showed the name Michael O'Brien and a birth date confirming he had just turned 18. The wound was clean. A German bullet had pierced his right lung, but by luck had missed vital organs. Hastings knew that without anesthesia the surgery would be a nightmare for the boy, but he also knew that 2 other soldiers were being carried in on stretchers at that very moment. Sarah held the young soldier's hand and explained in a calm voice that they would do everything possible to minimize the pain, but that it was necessary to save morphine for more critical cases. O'Brien nodded, trying to look braver than he really felt. Porter moved closer and held the other hand, whispering stories about his hometown to distract him from the preparations for surgery. The decision was made. O'Brien would be operated on with only a minimal dose of morphine to take the edge off the pain. The war forced doctors to become philosophers of survival, weighing lives on a scale no one should ever have to use. Sarah Mitchell's hands worked with mechanical precision as she cleaned and sterilized the surgical instruments in a basin of boiling water heated over an improvised stove. The hot steam created a dense fog in the cellar's icy air, and she had to constantly wipe her glasses to keep her vision clear. Her experience in French field hospitals had taught her that proper sterilization could mean the difference between life and death from post-operative infection. The metallic sound of instruments being arranged created an almost hypnotic rhythm that helped everyone maintain focus during long procedures. She checked the supply of sutures again. Only 3 rolls of surgical thread remained, and they would have to be used with extreme care. Sarah had learned stitching techniques that maximized healing with minimal material, skills not found in traditional medical manuals. The rough texture of the reused surgical thread between her fingers was a constant reminder of the material limitations they faced. When young nurses asked about fieldwork, she always said that wartime medicine meant improvising without ever compromising the quality of care. War had turned nurses into specialists in medical logistics under extreme pressure. "Doctor?" Hastings made the first incision in O'Brien's chest while Porter gripped the young soldier's shoulders tightly to prevent sudden movement. The boy clenched his teeth and groaned but did not scream, a display of courage that impressed even the battle-hardened doctor. The sound of the patient's uneven breathing mingled with the distant rattle of German machine guns, creating a surreal soundtrack for the emergency surgery. Hastings quickly located the lung wound and began to remove fragments of damaged tissue and stop the internal bleeding. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who had performed hundreds of similar procedures during the months of combat in Europe. Sarah anticipated every instrument he needed, creating a perfect synchronization that made the surgery more efficient. The smell of blood and disinfectant grew stronger as the procedure advanced, but no one in the cellar showed discomfort. Everyone had become accustomed to the odors of wartime medicine. Porter murmured words of encouragement in O'Brien's ear, telling stories about fishing on Lake Michigan to distract him from the pain. The surgery without full anesthesia had become a demonstration of human endurance that transcended traditional medical protocols. The sound of boots pounding on the stairs interrupted the surgical concentration as 2 soldiers came down, carrying a sergeant with multiple shrapnel wounds. The man was conscious but had lost a great deal of blood, his pallor indicating advanced shock. Sarah looked at Hastings and saw in his eyes the confirmation. This patient would receive one of the 2 remaining doses of morphine. The wounded sergeant's uniform bore the insignia of the Heavy Artillery Command, likely from the same unit Porter had served in before being injured. The proximity of the front was clear from the smell of gunpowder clinging to the soldier's clothes, and from the fresh wounds arriving with growing frequency. Hastings finished suturing O'Brien's lung with quick but precise movements, knowing he needed to free the table for the next critical patient. The young soldier had endured the entire surgery without fainting, showing a willpower that inspired everyone in the cellar. Porter helped O'Brien off the table and settled him in an improvised corner for recovery, whispering that the worst was over. The constant rotation of patients had turned that cellar into a medical assembly line where every second saved could mean another life. The war had taught that efficient medicine was not only about technique, but also about managing time and resources under extreme pressure. The wounded sergeant was placed on the table still warm with O'Brien's blood, and Hastings quickly assessed the extent of the injuries. Multiple fragments had pierced the abdomen and one leg, creating a complex situation that required a more elaborate surgery. Sarah prepared one of the remaining doses of morphine, and relief spread across the sergeant's face as the drug took effect. The contrast between the 2 surgeries, one with minimal anesthesia, the other with full pain relief, illustrated the impossible choices combat doctors faced every day. The sound of German artillery outside grew more intense, a reminder that Bastogne's siege was tightening and that more wounded would arrive before dawn. Porter gathered the few available blankets to keep O'Brien warm during recovery, showing how wounded soldiers cared for each other in that improvised hospital. The solidarity among patients had created a unique dynamic in which healing became a collective effort. Hastings took a deep breath before making the first incision in the sergeant's abdomen. knowing that this surgery would determine whether they could keep yet another vital piece of Bastogne's defense alive. "Sarah, prepare the table for the third patient, and pray we have enough supplies for everyone." The third surgery of the night began as German bombardments over Bastogne intensified, making the cellar shake with every nearby impact. The soldier on the operating table had lost part of his left leg in a German minefield, and the improvised leather belt tourniquet was starting to fail. "Doctor." Hastings knew he had only minutes to stop the bleeding before the soldier slipped into irreversible hypovolemic shock. The smell of early gangrene began to rise from the necrotic tissue, mingling with the lingering scent of ether and gunpowder that defined the atmosphere of that underground hospital. Sarah Mitchell prepared the amputation instruments with precise movements, though her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion after 18 consecutive hours of emergency surgeries. The sound of German machine guns echoed through the stone walls, a grim reminder that the front line was only a few yards away. Porter, still recovering from his own wounds, helped keep the soldier conscious by talking about plans for after the war. The sticky texture of coagulated blood on the surgical tools demanded constant cleaning, but clean water was growing scarce. War had turned doctors into artists of improvisation, creating medical solutions that defied traditional protocols. The wounded soldier whispered the name Betty over and over, as Hastings worked to save what remained of his leg. His dog tags identified him as Corporal John Matthews, from a farm in Iowa, just 21 years old. A yellowed photo in his shirt pocket showed a blonde girl smiling beside a barn, most likely the Betty, whose name he repeated like a mantra against the pain. Sarah held his hand and assured him that Betty would be waiting when he came home, no matter how many legs he brought back. The injury was far too severe to save the limb, but Hastings worked meticulously to preserve as much healthy tissue as possible, shaping a stump that would allow for a functional prosthesis in the future. The sound of the scalpel cutting through bone echoed hauntingly in the silent cellar, interrupted only by the patient's muffled groans. Porter shared stories about veterans he had met in American hospitals, men who had lost limbs but rebuilt full, happy lives. The morphine was working properly, allowing Matthews to remain conscious without unbearable pain. The amputation demanded absolute technical precision. Any poorly executed cut could complicate recovery or make the future use of a prosthesis impossible. War had taught them that preserving human dignity was as important as saving lives. The blood supply for transfusions had run out 2 days earlier, forcing the medical team to rely solely on saline solutions and the patient's natural ability to recover. Sarah arranged bottles of homemade saline, prepared with kitchen salt and boiled water, a solution far from ideal, but enough to keep blood pressure stable during surgery. Their improvised blood typing system consisted of quick tests using blood from volunteer donors among the less wounded soldiers. Porter had offered himself as a universal donor, but his own injuries still required him to conserve blood for his own recovery. The viscous texture of clotted plasma in the makeshift test tubes was a constant reminder of the technological limits they faced. Hastings had mastered vascular surgery techniques that minimized blood loss, skills developed specifically for field medicine without access to blood banks. The steady drip of homemade saline into Matthews's vein created a soothing rhythm that contrasted with the thunder of battle outside. Sarah constantly checked vital signs with an improvised stethoscope, made from a piece of rubber hose scavenged from the rubble. War had turned nurses into emergency medicine specialists to rival experienced physicians. Every patient saved without adequate resources represented a triumph of human creativity over the limitations of war. The fourth surgery of the night involved a soldier with a gunshot wound to the abdomen, a complex case that required internal exploration to locate and remove German bullets. Dr. Hastings washed his hands in a basin of warm water, watching as the blood from previous patients turned the water a deep, dark red. The kerosene lamp flickered dangerously with the vibrations of the explosions, casting dancing shadows that made delicate procedures even more difficult. Sarah lit a second lamp to improve visibility, though she knew the kerosene was also running low. The wounded soldier was semi-conscious, murmuring incoherent words that suggested delirium from blood loss or the onset of infection. Porter moved closer to the operating table and held the soldier's hand, whispering encouragement as Hastings prepared the surgical instruments. The smell of perforated intestines mixed with the other medical odors, creating a heavy atmosphere that required controlled breathing to avoid nausea. The slippery texture of the exposed internal organs demanded absolute precision of movement, especially with such inadequate lighting. War had turned surgeons into explorers of damaged human anatomy, searching for life amid the destruction of flesh. Each incision revealed a map of modern violence carved into young bodies that should have been studying or working, not fighting in a war. The discovery of 2 bullets lodged near the liver turned an emergency procedure into a precision operation that would last several hours. Hastings located the first bullet without difficulty, but the second lay dangerously close to the main hepatic artery. Sarah prepared improvised microsurgical instruments, using watchmaker's tweezers salvaged from a bombed-out house and sterilized with medical alcohol. The metallic sound of the bullets being removed and dropped into a metal tray echoed through the cellar like inverted funeral bells, symbols of life reclaimed from death. Porter kept up a constant conversation with the patient to monitor his level of consciousness, asking about family, hobbies, and future plans as a form of neurological check. Removing the second bullet required complex internal sutures to repair damage to the intestinal wall, work that would normally be done in a fully equipped hospital. The smell of intestinal bile indicated a perforation that needed immediate repair to prevent fatal peritonitis. Sarah anticipated every instrument with near telepathic accuracy, demonstrating the synchronicity developed through dozens of surgeries under extreme conditions. War had created medical partnerships that functioned like a single organism, each person perfectly complementing the other's skills. Hastings worked for 3 consecutive hours to remove the bullets, pausing only to wipe away the sweat that blurred his vision. The success of this surgery depended not only on technical skill, but also on physical and mental endurance few civilian doctors had ever needed to show. Dawn broke on December 23rd, with even more intense German bombardments, signaling that the Nazis were preparing a final assault on Bastogne's perimeter. The basement hospital had received 12 patients during the night, and 7 had survived the emergency surgeries performed with minimal resources. Porter helped organize the recovering soldiers, creating a system of post-operative care built on mutual solidarity among the wounded. Sarah mentally cataloged the remaining supplies: no morphine, 3 rolls of suture, half a bottle of ether, and enough clean water for just 2 more days. The sound of German aircraft overhead added fresh tension. An air raid could collapse the cellar that served as their medical refuge. Hastings washed the surgical instruments one last time that night, noticing how his hands remained steady despite the extreme fatigue. The rough texture of homemade soap rendered from animal fat and ashes between his fingers reminded him that even basic hygiene products had to be improvised. The smell of disinfectant mingled with the smoke of battle had become the signature scent of that wartime hospital. Porter remarked that the soldiers saved that night would soon return to the fight as soon as they recovered, fueling Bastogne's heroic resistance. The war had revealed that combat medicine did more than save individual lives. It kept alive the collective hope of a besieged city. Each successful surgery was a silent victory against the German war machine that sought to break American morale through terror and atrocity. Doctor, news just arrived from headquarters. Medical supply parachutes have been sighted east of the city. The white parachutes descending against the gray December sky looked like unlikely angels bringing hope to Bastogne's underground hospital. For the first time in 3 days, Dr. Hastings climbed up to street level, shielding his eyes from the brightness after so long working by lamplight. The sound of American C-47 aircraft slicing through the icy air was like celestial music after days of hearing only German artillery and the moans of wounded soldiers. Sarah Mitchell quickly organized a recovery team using injured soldiers who could still walk, turning patients into improvised carriers of medical supplies. The scent of fresh snow mixed with burnt gunpowder filled the morning air, a fragrance symbolizing renewal amid destruction. Porter limped up the stairs, leaning on an improvised cane, determined to help retrieve the supplies that could save his fellow wounded. The coarse texture of snow beneath his boots created a surreal contrast with the claustrophobic basement, where they had worked tirelessly. Each parachute crate represented a renewed chance to keep soldiers alive through the coming days of siege. War was proving that hope could literally fall from the sky when least expected. The first crate opened, revealed enough morphine for at least 20 complex surgeries, making Sarah exhale in relief for the first time in a week. The gleaming ampules of the painkiller looked like tiny treasures in a golden chest, promising pain relief for dozens of soldiers who would arrive wounded in the coming hours. Hastings found sterilized surgical instruments and hospital-grade sutures, equipment that would allow for more elaborate and safer procedures. The sound of paper tearing echoed through the bombed-out street as more crates were opened, revealing bandages, disinfectants, and even a few special Christmas rations. Porter discovered enough sulfa drugs to treat infections that had already begun to develop in some of the older patients. Sarah mentally planned the distribution of the new supplies, creating a system of priorities to maximize the number of lives saved. The soft texture of the fresh bandages contrasted sharply with the improvised rags they had been using, a reminder that proper medicine depended on quality materials. The scent of fresh medicines mixed with the icy air, creating an atmosphere of medical renewal amid the chaos of war. Hastings smiled for the first time in days, realizing these supplies meant the difference between survival medicine and true medical care. The arrival of the parachutes had transformed a hospital of despair into a functioning medical unit, capable of facing the coming days of the siege. Returning to the cellar with arms full of medical supplies created a restrained sense of celebration among the team and the recovering patients. Sarah administered proper doses of morphine to soldiers who had undergone surgery with insufficient anesthesia, providing retroactive relief that dramatically improved overall morale. The sound of patients' sighs of relief echoed through the cellar as chronic pain finally eased under appropriate medication. Hastings used the new instruments to revise some hastily sutured wounds, improving the chances of proper healing. Porter helped reorganize the medical space, creating specific areas for different types of treatment using the newly acquired organizational supplies. The smell of hospital-grade disinfectant gradually replaced the improvised odors that had characterized the underground hospital. The texture of professional bandages being applied to wounds brought a sense of medical professionalism that had been impossible with improvised materials. Sarah prepared sterilized syringes to administer antibiotics, a medical luxury they had not experienced in weeks. War revealed how basic medical resources could completely transform the quality of care. Each new supply represented not just technical improvement, but a renewal of hope that medicine could triumph over the destruction of war. The arrival of more wounded on the afternoon of December 23rd immediately tested the effectiveness of the new medical supplies in a series of complex surgeries. Dr. Hastings operated on a soldier with a head wound using proper equipment for the first time since the siege began, performing a precise trepanation that saved the young fighter's life. The sound of high-quality instruments cutting through bone created a cleaner, sharper echo than the improvised tools used before. Sarah administered proper anesthesia for every procedure, watching as patients fully relaxed for the first time in days, allowing for more delicate and efficient surgeries. Porter spoke with the newly arrived wounded about the improved medical conditions, boosting the morale of soldiers who had arrived panicked about the quality of treatment. The scent of hospital-grade ether replaced the makeshift odors of previous surgeries, creating a more professional and reassuring atmosphere. The texture of real silk sutures between Hastings' fingers allowed for more elegant closures that would heal with fewer keloids. Every surgery performed with proper equipment demonstrated the difference between emergency medicine and true medical care. The arrival of supplies had turned desperate doctors into confident professionals capable of offering first-rate treatment. War proved that adequate resources were not luxuries, but basic necessities for preserving human life with dignity. The medical triage system was reorganized using more sophisticated protocols made possible by the new supplies and diagnostic equipment. Sarah established clear priority categories based not only on the severity of injuries, but also on the likelihood of surgical success with the resources now available. The sound of professional stethoscopes being used for cardiac evaluation created an atmosphere of modern medicine in contrast to the improvised methods of previous days. Hastings could now perform more detailed examinations of internal injuries with proper exploratory instruments, diagnosing problems that previously went unnoticed. Porter helped create organized medical records for each patient, a documentation system that would have been impossible without the office materials included in the supply drops. The scent of fresh ink on the medical forms mingled with the medicinal aromas, creating a hospital atmosphere that felt both familiar and comforting. The texture of quality paper between their fingers allowed for detailed notes on each case, enabling long-term medical follow-up. Sarah organized a timed medication schedule using watches included in the supplies, allowing for more precise and effective pharmaceutical treatments. War demonstrated that proper medical organization could multiply the effectiveness of individual treatments. Each new protocol implemented was a victory of medical science over the desperate improvisation of the siege's first days. The parachutes had brought not only supplies, but also restored professional dignity to medical work under extreme conditions. Christmas Eve 1944 brought a brief pause in German bombardments, allowing the medical team to organize a small celebration for the recovering patients. Dr. Hastings distributed the special Christmas rations included in the airdropped supplies, giving the soldiers a decent meal after days of surviving on hard bread and water. The sound of quiet conversation replaced the constant groans of pain, showing how proper medical relief completely transformed the hospital's atmosphere. Sarah improvised Christmas decorations using white bandages and empty medicine bottles, creating a medical Christmas tree that symbolized life preserved amid destruction. Porter organized an impromptu choir of wounded soldiers singing Christmas hymns, their voices echoing against the stone walls, with a melancholy beauty that deeply touched everyone present. The scent of warm food mingled with the medicinal aromas, creating a unique fragrance of hope in wartime. The soft texture of new blankets distributed among the patients provided physical comfort that complemented medical healing with human dignity. Hastings watched his patients discussing future plans for the first time in weeks, realizing that proper medicine not only saved bodies, but also restored dreams and hope. War revealed that celebrating life was as important as preserving it. That Christmas Eve in Bastogne's basement proved that humanity could flourish, even under the most extreme circumstances. Every smile on the faces of the wounded soldiers represented a silent victory against the forces that sought to destroy not only bodies but human spirits. Doctor, headquarters has sent a message. Patton's troops have broken the siege and will arrive tomorrow morning. The roar of Patton's 4th Armored Division Sherman tanks echoing through the streets of Bastogne was the most beautiful music Dr. Hastings had ever heard. The metallic clatter of their treads over the frozen pavement mingled with the shouts of joy from American soldiers who had defended the city for 8 straight days. Sarah Mitchell ran up the cellar stairs for the first time in a week, her eyes filling with tears at the sight of the American flag waving above the liberating tanks. The smell of diesel from the Sherman's engines stood in sharp contrast to the stench of German gunpowder that had filled the air throughout the siege. Porter limped to the shattered window and waved to the tank crews, recognizing in their soot-streaked faces the same determination that had defined Bastogne's defenders. The rough texture of snow trampled by the tanks formed a trail of freedom that symbolized the end of deadly isolation. Each American soldier entering the city carried additional medical supplies, ammunition, and, most importantly, the promise of evacuation to rear area hospitals. Patton's arrival represented not just a military victory, but salvation for dozens of wounded soldiers who had been waiting for medical evacuation for days. The war proved that salvation could arrive in the form of noisy tanks, commanded by a general who never accepted defeat. The organized medical evacuation by the newly arrived forces turned the basement hospital into a triage station for transferring the most critical patients to better-equipped field hospitals. Dr. Hastings worked frantically to stabilize those who would be transported in the ambulances arriving with the relief troops. The sound of medical sirens echoing through the bombed-out streets created a symphony of hope after days of sepulchral silence broken only by explosions. Sarah prepared detailed medical reports for each patient being evacuated, documenting the treatments performed during the siege to ensure continuity of care. Porter helped arrange the stretchers, creating an efficient transport system that maximized the number of wounded evacuated on each trip. The smell of gasoline from the military ambulances mixed with the aroma of fresh medicines brought by the reinforcement medical teams. The texture of official medical forms in Hastings' hands contrasted with the improvised papers used during the siege, symbolizing a return to organized military medicine. Each evacuated soldier carried not only physical wounds, but also stories of medical courage that would be told for decades. The arrival of the reinforcement medical teams allowed Hastings to finally rest after a week of non-stop surgeries. The war proved that human endurance had limits, but determination could stretch those limits beyond imagination. The medical work performed during the siege had saved not only individual lives, but preserved the fighting strength of an entire military unit. General George S. Patton, Jr. personally descended into the basement hospital to greet the medical team that had kept Bastogne's defenders alive through the siege's most critical days. His commanding presence filled the small space, and his seasoned eyes quickly took in the improvised conditions where surgeries had saved dozens of lives. The sound of his military boots echoing on the stone floor created a martial rhythm that contrasted with the quiet movements of the medical team accustomed to working silently. Hastings reported the siege's medical statistics: 43 soldiers treated, 32 saved, 11 lost to wounds too severe for field medicine. Patton listened to every number with the focus of a commander who understood that living soldiers were more valuable than captured territory. Sarah showed the general the improvised instruments used during the siege's early days, explaining how the lack of supplies had forced medical innovations that could be applied in other theaters of operation. Porter described how wounded soldiers had cared for each other, creating a network of support that multiplied the effectiveness of the small medical team. The scent of Patton's Cuban cigars mingled with the medicinal aromas, creating a unique atmosphere of military celebration in a hospital setting. The war revealed that great generals recognized victories depended as much on doctors as on combat soldiers. Official recognition of the medical work done during the siege came in the form of military decorations presented by Patton himself in an impromptu ceremony in the basement. Dr. Hastings received the Bronze Star for exceptional heroism under combat conditions, an honor he accepted on behalf of all military doctors working under impossible circumstances. The metallic sound of medals being pinned to uniforms created a solemn echo that contrasted with the medical noises that had filled the space for a week. Sarah Mitchell was awarded the Army Medal for meritorious service in a combat zone, acknowledging that field nurses were as vital as any soldier on the front line. Porter received a Purple Heart for his combat wound, and an Army Commendation for exceptional assistance in emergency medical operations. The smell of polished metal from the medals mixed with the lingering scent of disinfectant, creating a unique fragrance of military honor in a medical environment. The texture of the colorful ribbons contrasted with the roughness of the dirty uniforms worn through days of intense medical work. Patton spoke briefly about how combat medics represented the best of human nature, preserving life while others took it. The war proved that heroism took many forms, and that saving lives required courage equal to, or greater than, that needed to take them. Each medal symbolized recognition that military medicine was a form of combat against the forces seeking to break the human spirit. Preparing to leave Bastogne meant meticulously documenting the improvised medical techniques developed during the siege for future use in other field hospitals. Dr. Hastings wrote detailed reports on surgical procedures performed without proper equipment, creating a manual of emergency medicine to be distributed to military doctors in every theater of operations. Sarah organized field nursing protocols that maximized efficiency with minimal resources, techniques that could save thousands of lives in future military campaigns. The sound of military typewriters echoed through the basement as clerks recorded each medical innovation developed during the siege. Porter contributed observations on how wounded soldiers could assist in medical operations, creating systems of mutual support that multiplied the capacity of small medical teams. The smell of fresh ink on the official documents mixed with the residual medicinal aromas, creating an atmosphere of intellectual work in a space still marked by urgent medical needs. The texture of carbon paper used for multiple copies of the reports ensured that the lessons of Bastogne would be widely shared among military medical units. Each documented procedure represented knowledge gained through extreme pressure and absolute necessity. War forced medical advances that would normally take decades to develop in peacetime. The work done in that improvised basement would help save lives far beyond the temporal and geographic limits of the Battle of the Bulge. Medical techniques born of desperation would become standard tools of modern military medicine. The final farewell to the basement that had served as a hospital during the battle's most critical days created a moment of deep reflection on the meaning of medicine in wartime. Dr. Hastings made a last inspection of the space where surgeries had saved dozens of American lives, noticing how bloodstains on the walls told the silent story of each procedure. Sarah gathered the remaining medical instruments, some of which had been improvised from debris, and had become effective tools of healing. The sound of footsteps echoing up the stairs as they left the basement created a rhythm of farewell that marked the end of an extraordinary chapter in field medicine. Porter climbed the stairs slowly, taking one last look at the place where he had learned that healing and wounding were inseparable aspects of the human experience in war. The lingering scent of ether and disinfectant would remain in that basement as a ghostly reminder of the operations performed there. The cold texture of the doorknob as Hastings closed it for the last time symbolized the end of an extraordinary chapter in military medicine. Everyone who left that basement carried memories of how medicine could triumph over the worst circumstances of war. The war had transformed an ordinary cellar into a cathedral of modern medicine, a sacred place where life had been preserved against all odds. The medical work carried out during the siege of Bastogne proved that humanity could flourish even in history's darkest moments. Those 8 days in the cellar would become legend in military medicine, inspiring future generations of combat doctors never to give up on saving lives. Doctors, you fought a different kind of battle here, and your victory was saving lives while others were taking them. The soldiers saved during the siege of Bastogne carried back to America extraordinary stories of doctors who performed miracles under impossible conditions. Young Michael O'Brien, operated on without proper anesthesia on the first night of the siege, returned to his farm in Ohio, bearing a chest scar that became a symbol of medical courage among veterans. The sound of his breathing, once nearly silenced on that improvised operating table, now filled his lungs with free American air, reminding him every day of the moment Dr. Hastings saved his life with his own hands. Sarah Mitchell received hundreds of letters from soldiers she had treated, each one describing how her calm presence during emergency surgeries had made the difference between panic and hope. Corporal John Matthews learned to walk with his prosthetic leg, visiting veterans' hospitals regularly, to tell how the doctors of Bastogne preserved his dignity, even as they saved his life. The scent of ink from the handwritten letters arriving from across the country created a fragrance of gratitude that filled Hastings's desk in his new clinic in Boston. The texture of the paper used by former soldiers to write their memories varied according to their economic circumstances, but all carried the same message of profound recognition. Porter organized annual reunions of Bastogne veterans, where the medical stories were told and retold, turning into legends that would inspire future generations. The war had forged bonds between doctors and patients that transcended traditional professional protocols, creating friendships that would last for decades. The medical techniques developed during the siege were incorporated into the official curriculum of military medical schools, turning desperate improvisations into standard procedures. Dr. Hastings was invited to lecture at the Army Medical Academy on field surgery under extreme conditions, sharing knowledge earned under unimaginable pressure. The sound of medical students taking notes during his lectures echoed through the amphitheaters, perpetuating lessons learned in a bombed-out cellar in Bastogne. Sarah Mitchell developed military nursing protocols adopted by the Army Nurse Corps, establishing standards that would save thousands of lives in future conflicts. The medical triage innovations created during the siege became models for field hospitals in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The smell of formalin in the anatomy labs where Hastings taught contrasted with the improvised ether that had characterized Bastogne's surgeries. The smooth texture of modern scalpels in his hands during demonstrations always reminded him of the improvised instruments that had saved so many lives. Porter became a first aid instructor for soldiers, teaching medical support techniques that multiplied the effectiveness of small medical teams. The war had transformed personal traumatic experiences into collective knowledge that would benefit military medicine for generations. Each technique taught carried with it the memory of the soldiers who had been saved by its original application. The Bastogne cellar had become an invisible classroom present in every modern military hospital. The decorations received for medical heroism during the siege opened doors to advanced research in trauma medicine and emergency surgery at major American universities. Dr. Hastings established the first residency program in wartime trauma medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital, attracting the country's best medical students. The sound of ambulances arriving at the Boston emergency room always mentally transported him back to that cellar, where every second meant the difference between life and death. Sarah Mitchell founded a nursing school specializing in field medicine, where nurses learned how to improvise without ever compromising the quality of care. Government-funded research on emergency medicine used data collected during the Bastogne siege as the foundation for innovations that would benefit both military and civilian medicine. The smell of modern laboratories developing new surgical techniques always evoked memories of the improvised aromas of that underground hospital. The texture of state-of-the-art medical equipment contrasted with memories of the rough instruments that had proven their worth under extreme pressure. Porter worked with medical equipment manufacturers to develop emergency kits inspired by the improvisations used during the siege. The war had shown that medical innovation was born of extreme necessity, not the comfort of well-equipped laboratories. Each scientific breakthrough developed from Bastogne's experiences was a retroactive victory over the forces that had tried to break the medical spirit during the siege. Knowledge gained through suffering had become a tool to prevent future suffering. The influence of Bastogne's medical experiences extended beyond military medicine, revolutionizing emergency treatment in civilian hospitals across America. Dr. Hastings published scientific articles on surgery under extreme pressure that were translated into dozens of languages and studied in medical schools worldwide. The sound of academic medical debates on Bastogne techniques echoed at international conferences, spreading knowledge born of war to benefit peace. Sarah Mitchell wrote an emergency nursing manual that became a standard text in medical training programs, turning lessons learned under Crossfire into formal education. The survival statistics of patients treated during the siege proved scientifically that improvised medicine could rival traditional hospital care when applied with skill and determination. The scent of medical libraries where their work was studied contrasted sharply with the smells of gunpowder and ether that had inspired the original techniques. The texture of the textbook pages documenting their innovations perpetuated knowledge gained through direct experience with life and death. Porter helped create medical simulators that allowed doctors to train for conditions similar to those faced during the siege, without the real risk. The war had proven that extreme experience produced exceptional specialists, but proper simulation could prepare doctors for extreme situations without waiting for them to happen. Every civilian hospital that adopted protocols inspired by Bastogne saved lives that would never know the military origin of their salvation. The medical legacy of the siege transcended national and temporal boundaries, benefiting humanity far beyond the American soldiers originally treated. The veterans saved by Bastogne's doctors became informal ambassadors of military medical excellence, sharing stories that inspired an entire generation to view medicine as a form of patriotic service. Michael O'Brien spoke regularly in high schools about how military doctors were as heroic as combat soldiers, influencing dozens of young people to pursue medical careers. The sound of students' enthusiastic applause after his talks demonstrated how stories of medical courage could inspire lives dedicated to saving others. John Matthews, walking on his prosthetic leg, visited rehabilitation hospitals to show patients that physical limitations did not prevent full, productive lives. Sergeant Porter organized fundraising campaigns for military medical research, mobilizing veterans to support advances that would benefit future soldiers. The smell of printing ink on the pamphlets he distributed evoked memories of the medical stories that needed to be preserved and shared. The texture of old Bastogne photographs he showed during presentations created visual connections to experiences that words alone could not fully convey. Sarah Mitchell received hundreds of letters from young nurses inspired by her stories to specialize in emergency and trauma medicine. The war had created models of medical heroism that influenced professional choices for decades. Everyone inspired by the stories of Bastogne became a multiplier of the medical legacy of those extraordinary 8 days. The impact of the medical decisions made in that cellar reached far beyond the soldiers directly treated, touching thousands of lives through inspiration and example. Commemorations of Bastogne's liberation anniversary became a tradition that brought together military doctors, treated veterans, and their families in a celebration of life preserved against all odds. Dr. Hastings, Sarah Mitchell, and Porter returned each year to Belgium to visit the site of their improvised hospital, now transformed into a small museum of military medicine. The sound of Belgian children playing in streets that once echoed with explosions created a soundtrack of peace that contrasted sharply with their war memories. Local residents preserved the cellar exactly as it had been at the end of the siege, keeping medical instruments and equipment as monuments to medical dedication during the occupation. Fresh flowers placed daily by Belgian citizens at the medical memorial created a fragrance of gratitude that honored both doctors and patients. The texture of the cellar stones, still stained with blood from surgeries performed decades earlier, served as a tangible reminder that medicine transcends nationalities and conflicts. Hastings always left a single red rose on the improvised table where he had operated on so many soldiers, a personal ritual of respect for those who did not survive. Sarah established a scholarship fund for Belgian medical students, perpetuating the legacy of international collaboration born of war. The war had forged bonds between doctors and communities that endured long after the original conflict. Each visit to the cellar reinforced the understanding that medicine is a universal force of humanity that can flourish even in the most extreme circumstances. The small underground hospital had become an international symbol of how medical dedication can triumph over the destruction of war. 30 years later, I still receive letters from soldiers we saved. Their lives remain our greatest victory. Dr. Hastings' final visit to the Bastogne cellar came 50 years after the siege, when his hands already trembled with age, but his eyes still shone with the determination that had saved so many lives. The sound of his slow steps descending those familiar stairs echoed like a temporal refrain, linking present and past in a symphony of medical memories. Sarah Mitchell, at 75, still carried the upright posture that had defined her calming presence during the siege's most critical surgeries. The scent of fresh flowers left by visitors from around the world mingled with the residual smell of medicines that seemed permanently embedded in the stone walls. Porter, walking with difficulty but determined to make one more pilgrimage to that sacred site of military medicine, held in his hands a list of the 43 soldiers treated during those 8 extraordinary days. The rough texture of the cellar's stones beneath their aged hands evoked tactile memories of icy surgical instruments and improvised bandages that had saved lives against all odds. Dozens of young doctors accompanied the veterans on that visit, seeking inspiration at the place where modern military medicine had been born of absolute necessity. War had transformed that ordinary cellar into a cathedral of medicine where every stone told a story of life preserved. Time had not diminished the emotional impact of returning to the place where medicine triumphed over death through pure human resolve. Every surface in the cellar carried invisible memories of surgeries that defined not only individual destinies, but the future of emergency medicine. The medical students who visited the cellar museum listened with near religious reverence as Hastings described each surgery performed in that confined space during the German siege. The sound of his words echoing off the walls created the atmosphere of a masterclass in which history became living, inspiring medical education. Sarah demonstrated field nursing techniques that had saved lives when traditional resources didn't exist, showing how medical creativity could overcome material limitations. The new generation of doctors touched the preserved instruments with reverence, trying to imagine how they had been used to accomplish medical miracles under combat pressure. Porter told stories about specific soldiers, turning medical statistics into human faces that gave personal meaning to technical procedures. The smell of modern disinfectant used to preserve the artifacts contrasted with memories of the improvised aromas that had defined the original hospital. The texture of the old medical tools let students feel the difference between today's equipment and the rugged instruments that had proved absolutely effective. Every young doctor who visited the cellar left with a renewed understanding that true medicine does not depend on technology, but on human dedication and skill. War had created a permanent medical school, where practical lessons were taught through historical example. Generations of doctors would continue learning in that cellar that medicine transcends eras and circumstances when driven by an absolute commitment to preserving life. The site had become an educational temple, where theoretical medicine met extreme practical application. The final documentation of Bastogne's medical experience concluded with the publication of a definitive work on trauma medicine that became a global reference in medical schools. Dr. Hastings devoted his final academic years to systematizing every technique, every improvisation, every decision made during those critical days of the siege. The sound of tireless typewriters provided a soundtrack of historical preservation that ensured no medical lesson would be lost to time. Sarah contributed by photographing each preserved instrument, creating a visual atlas that would let future generations understand exactly how medicine had worked under extreme conditions. The scientific precision applied to documenting the experience turned personal memories into objective medical knowledge that would benefit humanity indefinitely. The smell of fresh ink in the published volumes carried the fragrance of intellectual preservation, guaranteeing a kind of immortality for techniques born of desperation. The fine paper used in the definitive edition contrasted with the improvised materials that had served for the original documentation during the siege. Porter contributed the patient's perspective, enriching medical understanding of how the wounded experienced treatment in the field. The war had proven that medicine is not only technical science, but a human art, combining knowledge and compassion. Each printed page represented a victory over forgetting, preserving forever, the lessons earned through direct experience with life and death. The documentation transformed traumatic personal experiences into educational resources that would benefit medical students for centuries. International recognition of the medical contributions made during the siege culminated in the creation of the Hastings Mitchell Porter Medal for Excellence in Field Medicine, awarded annually to military clinicians who demonstrated extraordinary creativity and dedication. The inaugural ceremony took place in the Bastogne cellar itself, with representatives from global medical organizations paying tribute to the pioneers of modern trauma care. The sound of national anthems from many countries echoing through the stone vaults created an atmosphere of international celebration of medicine as a universal force for good. Sarah received honorary degrees from dozens of universities, acknowledging how field nursing evolved through her innovations during the siege. The medal itself was forged using metal from preserved original surgical instruments, creating a physical link between the past and the future of military medicine. The smell of polished bronze from the metals mingled with the cellar's lingering aromas, producing a unique fragrance of medical honor, won through extreme sacrifice. The engraved surface of the metals reproduced the contours of the improvised instruments that had saved so many lives decades earlier. Porter delivered the keynote address, representing all the soldiers who had survived thanks to the extraordinary medicine practiced during the siege. The war had created a legacy that transcended national borders, inspiring international military medicine through an example of uncompromising excellence. Each medal awarded would perpetuate the standards established in that cellar, ensuring future generations of military doctors aspired to the level of dedication shown during the siege. Official recognition turned personal experiences into international benchmarks that would elevate the quality of military medicine worldwide. The medical philosophy developed during the siege of Bastogne influenced not only military care, but also revolutionized civilian approaches to disaster and emergency medicine. Dr. Hastings articulated principles of medicine of infinite possibilities, teaching doctors never to accept limitations as an excuse not to attempt to save a life. The sound of international medical conferences discussing the Bastogne principles echoed in hospital auditoriums around the world, spreading a philosophy born of war to benefit peace. Sarah developed nursing theory that emphasized creative adaptation over strict protocol compliance, empowering nurses to innovate when necessary. The triage methods developed during the siege became standard in emergency departments, enabling civilian hospitals to function efficiently during natural disasters and mass casualty incidents. The scent of modern hospitals applying protocols inspired by Bastogne carried aromatic echoes of that cellar where it all began. The texture of contemporary medical equipment reflected design shaped by lessons on functionality under pressure learned during the siege. Porter worked with humanitarian organizations to apply Bastogne's medical principles in civilian disaster zones, multiplying the impact of the original techniques. The war had shown that exceptional medicine arises from extreme circumstances, but that the principles developed can be applied anywhere excellence is required. Every hospital that adopted Bastogne's philosophy saved lives using lessons forged under unimaginable pressure 60 years earlier. The medical influence of the siege spread far beyond its original bounds, touching millions of patients who never knew the military origin of their salvation. The final official act of Bastogne's doctors was the creation of an international foundation dedicated to training clinicians to work under extreme conditions, ensuring that knowledge earned through suffering would continue saving lives indefinitely. Dr. Hastings donated his personal fortune to establish trauma medicine training centers that reproduced conditions similar to those faced during the siege. The sound of students practicing surgery under simulated pressure echoed in laboratories designed to perpetuate Bastogne's lessons, preparing doctors for situations they hoped never to encounter. Sarah set up exchange programs that allowed nurses from developing nations to learn advanced techniques of medical improvisation. The foundation funded emergency medicine research that continued expanding knowledge first developed in that bombed-out cellar. The smell of modern labs testing medical innovations evoked memories of the improvised aromas that had inspired the original techniques. The texture of state-of-the-art medical simulators allowed doctors to train under controlled conditions that replicated the real pressure of extreme medical emergencies. Porter coordinated programs that sent veteran clinicians to teach in conflict zones around the world, multiplying the impact of the siege's lessons. The war had proven that medical knowledge is the most valuable gift one generation can leave to the next. Every doctor trained by the Foundation carried fragments of the wisdom earned in that cellar over 8 extraordinary days. Bastogne's medical legacy had become immortal, continuing to save lives long after its originators had passed, ensuring the extraordinary medicine practiced during the siege would benefit humanity for generations without end. The medicine we practiced in that cellar proved that saving lives doesn't depend on perfect equipment, but on hearts determined never to give up on human hope. Epilogue: The eternal legacy of the doctors of Bastogne. Today, more than 80 years after those 8 extraordinary days in Bastogne's bombed-out cellar, the medical techniques developed during the siege continue to save lives in military and civilian hospitals around the world. The small museum of military medicine established in that historic cellar receives thousands of visitors each year. Doctors, nurses, students, and veterans who come seeking inspiration at the place where modern trauma care was born of absolute necessity. The stone walls still hold the invisible stains of blood shed during surgeries that defied every traditional medical protocol. The preserved instruments silently tell the story of how medical improvisation became scientific innovation. The lingering scent of ether and disinfectant remains in the air like an aromatic ghost that links present and past in a temporal symphony of healing. Dr. Robert Hastings, Sarah Mitchell, and Sergeant James Porter passed away decades ago, but their legacy lives on in every emergency surgery performed under pressure, in every nurse who improvises creative solutions, in every wounded soldier who receives dignified care even in the harshest conditions. Their techniques saved thousands of lives in the wars that followed: Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, Afghanistan, Iraq, and continue to be applied in civilian disaster zones across the globe. The Bastogne cellar has become more than a museum. It has become a universal symbol that true medicine transcends material limitations when driven by absolute compassion and unshakable resolve. Every physician who visits leaves with a renewed understanding that saving lives is the noblest of human missions. War can destroy cities, divide families, and take lives, but it can also reveal the best of human nature. In that frozen cellar in December 1944, 3 ordinary people became extraordinary heroes, proving that medicine is more than science. It is love in action, hope made tangible, humanity at its purest. American combat medics defied Crossfire and saved hundreds in the Battle of Bastogne, was not merely a war story, but an eternal testament that even in humanity's darkest hours, there will always be hands willing to heal, hearts determined to preserve life, and souls brave enough to choose hope when all seems lost. The echo of their voices still resounds in that cellar. As long as there is life, there is hope. And as long as there is hope, we will never stop fighting to save every beating heart.